A millionaire saw a homeless woman with twins on the street. Little did he know, she was his first love. What he did next left everyone in tears. Watch till the end to see how their lives change forever. Before we dive into this unforgettable story, make sure you're subscribed to Epic Story Moments and hit that bell icon so you never miss another amazing tale. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to like, share, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more heartwarming stories your way. The late afternoon sun bathed the city in a golden glow as Marcus Rivers leaned back in the plush leather seat of his limousine. The hum of traffic outside barely registered to him. His mind was consumed by the outcome of his latest business deal. Marcus was a man who thrived on control. His life, a carefully orchestrated sequence of decisions, revolved around power, precision, and discipline. Emotions, distractions, and sentimentality had no place in his meticulously curated existence. As the limo slowed to a crawl near a busy intersection, Marcus glanced out the tinted window. His sharp eyes scanned the bustling sidewalks, a part of the city he rarely visited. It was a chaotic tangle of lives and stories, far removed from his own insulated world. And then he saw her. At first, it was just another scene of urban decay. A woman crouched on the edge of the sidewalk, clutching two small children to her sides. Her clothes were worn and ill-fitting, her dark curls matted with dirt. The two girls, no older than 3, clung to her like frightened animals, their small hands gripping the tattered fabric of her coat. One child whimpered softly, while the other buried her face in her mother's side, her tiny frame trembling. Something about the scene struck Marcus harder than he expected. He couldn't place it at first. What about this woman held his attention? Then she looked up. Her face was thin and weathered, a stark contrast to the vibrant image that flashed in his memory. But there was no mistaking those eyes. He recognized her instantly. Celeste, the girl who had once lit up the halls of their high school with her confidence and charisma. She had been everything he wasn't: outgoing, popular, adored. He'd admired her from afar, harboring a quiet affection she'd never known. She had barely noticed him back then, except perhaps to laugh at his awkwardness when they crossed paths. And now, here she was, reduced to a shadow of her former self. "Stop the car," Marcus commanded, his voice cutting through the silence inside the limousine. The driver hesitated for a moment, but Marcus's tone brooked no argument. The vehicle rolled to a halt by the curb, drawing a few curious glances from passers-by. Marcus stepped out, his polished shoes landing on the uneven pavement with purpose. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit as he approached her. Celeste flinched at his shadow, pulling her daughters closer, as though shielding them from an unseen threat. Her gaze darted up to his face, and for a moment, recognition flickered in her eyes. It was gone just as quickly, replaced by a mix of weariness and shame. She turned her head away, as though hoping he wouldn't say anything, but Marcus was already speaking. "Celeste," she didn't respond. The tension in her body made it clear she had no intention of engaging with him. Her shoulders were hunched, her arms wrapped protectively around the children. One of the girls peeked up at Marcus with wide, frightened eyes before burying her face in her mother's side again. "Celeste," Marcus repeated, his voice softer now, though no less firm. "It's me, Marcus. Marcus Rivers." She let out a shaky breath but didn't look at him. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "What do you want?" The question hit him harder than he expected. What did he want? He didn't have an answer. All he knew was that he couldn't walk away. Not now. Not after seeing her like this. "I want to help," he said simply. Her laugh was bitter, dry. "Help? Why would someone like you want to help someone like me?" Marcus felt a pang of guilt at her words. He couldn't blame her for thinking that way. After all, he had spent years building a reputation as a man who cared for little beyond his empire. Empathy and generosity were traits no one associated with Marcus Rivers. But this wasn't about his reputation. It wasn't about appearances or charity. It was about Celeste, the woman who had once seemed untouchable, invincible, the woman he had quietly admired, even as she ignored him. "It doesn't matter why," he said finally. "What matters is that you and your children don't have to stay here." Celeste finally looked up at him, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "We don't need your pity." "This isn't pity," Marcus said firmly. "It's a chance. For you. For them." He gestured toward the girls, who were now staring up at him with wide, curious eyes. For a long moment, Celeste said nothing. Her gaze flickered between her daughters and Marcus, the internal struggle playing out on her face. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "Fine," she said, "but only for them." Marcus nodded, sensing the weight of her words. He extended a hand to help her up, but she ignored it, rising on her own. The children clung to her legs as she stood, their tiny faces peeking out from behind her coat. The limousine waited at the curb, its polished exterior a stark contrast to the grimy surroundings. Marcus opened the door and stepped aside, waiting as Celeste hesitated. One of the girls tugged on her sleeve, and she glanced down at them. Whatever she saw in their faces seemed to solidify her decision. She climbed into the car, the girls following close behind. Marcus slid in after them, closing the door with a soft click. The hum of the engine filled the silence as the car began to move again. He glanced at Celeste out of the corner of his eye. She sat stiffly, her hands clutching the edges of her coat as though bracing herself for judgment. But Marcus didn't speak. He knew better than to push her. For now, it was enough that she was here, that she had agreed to accept his help. The rest would come in time. Marcus stepped out of the limousine, his polished shoes crunching against the uneven pavement. The city's noise, honking cars, distant chatter, and the hum of life faded into the background as he approached Celeste. She flinched at his shadow, pulling her daughters closer, as if shielding them from an unseen threat. Her eyes darted up to his face, and for a brief moment, recognition flickered in them. But just as quickly, it was replaced by weariness and shame. She turned her head away, hoping he would leave. "Celeste," Marcus said, his voice firm but not unkind. She didn't respond. Her shoulders were hunched, her arms wrapped tightly around the twins. One of the girls peeked up at Marcus with wide, frightened eyes before burying her face in her mother's side again. "Celeste," Marcus repeated, softer this time. "It's me, Marcus. Marcus Rivers." She let out a shaky breath, but still refused to look at him. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. "What do you want?" The question caught him off guard. What did he want? He hadn't thought that far ahead. All he knew was that he couldn't walk away. Not now. Not after seeing her like this. "I want to help," he said simply. Her laugh was bitter, devoid of any real humor. "Help? Why would someone like you want to help someone like me?" Marcus felt a pang of guilt. He couldn't blame her for thinking that way. After all, he had spent years building a reputation as a man who cared for little beyond his empire. Empathy and generosity were traits no one associated with Marcus Rivers. But this wasn't about his reputation. It wasn't about appearances or charity. It was about Celeste, the woman who had once seemed untouchable, invincible, the woman he had quietly admired, even as she ignored him. "It doesn't matter why," he said finally. "What matters is that you and your children don't have to stay here." Celeste finally looked up at him, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "We don't need your pity." "This isn't pity," Marcus said firmly. "It's a chance. For you. For them." He gestured toward the twins, who were now staring up at him with wide, curious eyes. For a long moment, Celeste said nothing. Her gaze flickered between her daughters and Marcus, the internal struggle playing out on her face. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "Fine," she said, "but only for them." Marcus nodded, sensing the weight of her words. He extended a hand to help her up, but she ignored it, rising on her own. The twins clung to her legs as she stood, their tiny faces peeking out from behind her coat. The limousine waited at the curb, its polished exterior a stark contrast to the grimy surroundings. Marcus opened the door and stepped aside, waiting as Celeste hesitated. One of the girls tugged on her sleeve, and she glanced down at them. Whatever she saw in their faces seemed to solidify her decision. She climbed into the car, the twins following close behind. Marcus slid in after them, closing the door with a soft click. The hum of the engine filled the silence as the car began to move again. Celeste sat stiffly, her hands clutching the edges of her coat as though bracing herself for judgment. The twins, however, seemed to relax slightly, their wide eyes taking in the luxurious interior of the limousine. The older one, Lila, reached out to touch the smooth leather seat, her tiny fingers tracing the seams. Marcus glanced at Celeste out of the corner of his eye. She was staring out the window, her jaw clenched, her body tense. He wanted to say something, to reassure her, to tell her that everything would be okay, but he knew better than to push her. For now, it was enough that she was here. The city blurred past the windows as the limousine made its way toward Marcus's penthouse. The twins, exhausted from the day's events, soon fell asleep, their heads resting against their mother's shoulders. Celeste, however, remained awake, her gaze fixed on the passing buildings. When the car finally pulled into the private driveway of Marcus's penthouse, Celeste's breath hitched. The towering building, a beacon of glass and steel, stood in stark contrast to the gritty streets they had just left behind. The driver opened the door and Marcus stepped out first, holding it open for Celeste. She hesitated, casting a glance at her sleeping daughters before finally stepping out. The twins stirred, their small hands clutching her coat as they looked around with wide, uncertain eyes. "This way," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. He gestured toward the building's entrance. The lobby was expansive, its polished marble floors gleaming under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. Modern art pieces adorned the walls, and the faint scent of fresh flowers lingered in the air. Celeste's footsteps echoed as she followed Marcus through the space, the twins sticking close to her sides. Their small, dirty shoes looked out of place against the pristine floors. As they approached the private elevator, a woman in her 60s appeared from an adjacent hallway. She was impeccably dressed, her silver hair neatly pinned back. This was Mrs. Lynch, Marcus's longtime housekeeper and a figure of quiet efficiency. "Good evening, Mr. Rivers," Mrs. Lynch said, her eyes briefly flickering to Celeste and the twins. There was a moment of hesitation in her expression, but she quickly recovered. "Shall I prepare the guest quarters?" "Yes, Mrs. Lynch," Marcus replied without missing a beat. "Make sure they have everything they need." Mrs. Lynch nodded, her gaze softening as she turned to Celeste. "Welcome, Mississippi. Let me know if there's anything you require." Celeste managed a faint nod, her voice barely audible as she murmured, "Thank you." The elevator door slid open, and the group stepped inside. As they ascended to the penthouse, Marcus noticed the way Celeste held herself, tense guarded, as though bracing for something to go wrong. Her daughters, however, seemed fascinated by the mirrored walls of the elevator, their wide eyes reflecting the soft light. When the doors opened, they stepped into the penthouse, a sprawling space that seemed to stretch endlessly. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city lights, while sleek, modern furnishings filled the open-concept living area. A grand piano stood in one corner, its polished surface reflecting the soft glow of the overhead lights. Celeste stood frozen in the entryway, her eyes darting around the room as though she couldn't quite process what she was seeing. The twins, however, were less reserved. Lila tugged at her mother's hand, pointing at the windows. "Mommy, look," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. Celeste glanced down at her, a faint, tired smile tugging at her lips. "It's beautiful," she murmured, though her voice carried more disbelief than admiration. Marcus stepped forward, breaking the silence. "You'll stay here," he said simply. "Mrs. Lynch will show you to your rooms." Before Celeste could respond, Mrs. Lynch appeared at her side. "If you'll follow me, miss," she said gently, motioning toward a hallway that led to the guest quarters. Celeste hesitated, casting a glance at Marcus as though searching for confirmation. He gave a slight nod, and she finally followed Mrs. Lynch down the hallway, the twins trailing behind her. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting a warm glow over the sleek, modern furnishings. Celeste sat at the kitchen island, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. She was dressed in borrowed clothes, a simple sweater and loose pants provided by Mrs. Lynch. But even clean and rested for the first time in weeks, she still looked guarded, as though ready to flee at a moment's notice. Marcus entered the kitchen, his sharp gaze studying her as he poured himself a cup of coffee. "Sleep well?" he asked, his tone casual. Celeste nodded, though her eyes remained fixed on the mug in her hands. The girls did. They've never slept in bed so soft. Marcus leaned against the counter, sipping his coffee. "They'll get used to it. And so will you." She didn't respond, her fingers tightening around the mug. Marcus could sense the tension in her, the internal struggle between gratitude and pride. He knew better than to push her, but he also knew that she and the girls needed more than just a roof over their heads. "I've made some arrangements," he said after a moment, setting his cup down. Celeste looked up, her brow furrowing. "What kind of arrangements?" "First, I've scheduled medical checkups for you and the girls," Marcus explained. "I want to make sure you're all healthy." She shook her head, her voice rising slightly. "Marcus, we don't need." "You do," he interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "Lila and Nia are malnourished, and you've been through more than anyone should have to endure. This isn't up for debate." Celeste opened her mouth to argue but thought better of it. She sighed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "Fine, but only for the girls." Marcus nodded, sensing a small victory. "Second, I've enrolled you in a professional development program. It's a 6-month course that will help you gain new skills and prepare for job opportunities." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "A job? Marcus, I haven't worked in years. I don't even know where to start." "You'll learn," he said simply. "The program is online, so you can study from here. Mrs. Lynch will help with the girls while you focus on your coursework." Celeste stared at him, her emotions swirling. She felt a deep gratitude for his belief in her, but also a lingering doubt about her own abilities. I don't know if I can do this," she admitted quietly. "You can," Marcus said firmly, "and I'll be here to support you." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the distant chatter of the girls in the living room, where Mrs. Lynch was helping them with breakfast. Finally, Celeste nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Okay, I'll do it." Over the next few days, Marcus's arrangements began to take shape. A trusted family doctor visited the penthouse to examine Celeste and the twins. The girls, though shy at first, quickly warmed up to the doctor, especially when she offered them lollipops after their checkups. "They're malnourished," the doctor told Marcus privately, "but otherwise healthy. With proper care and nutrition, they'll bounce back quickly." Celeste, too, was given a clean bill of health, though the doctor recommended that she focus on rest and self-care to recover from years of stress. Meanwhile, Marcus's assistant delivered a laptop and course materials for Celeste's professional development program. She approached the lessons hesitantly at first, struggling to keep up with the unfamiliar material. But as the days turned into weeks, she found herself gaining confidence. One afternoon, as she worked on an assignment in the study that Marcus had set up for her, he entered the room carrying a tray with 2 cups of coffee. "You've been at this for hours," he said, setting the tray down on the desk. "Take a break." Celeste glanced up, her expression tired but determined. "I can't. This is due tomorrow, and I still don't understand half of it." Marcus leaned against the desk, his arms crossed. "Let me see." She hesitated before sliding the laptop toward him. He scanned the document, his brow furrowing. "You're overthinking it," he said after a moment. Break it down into smaller steps. She watched as he pointed out areas where she could simplify her approach, his explanations clear and concise. For the first time, she began to see a way forward. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I don't think I could do this without you." Marcus met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "You're doing this on your own, Celeste. I'm just here to remind you of what you're capable of." As Celeste began to thrive, Lila and Nia flourished as well. The girls, once shy and withdrawn, became lively and curious. They adored Mrs. Lynch, who indulged them with homemade treats and stories, and they grew increasingly attached to Marcus. One evening, as Marcus sat on the living room floor assembling a puzzle with the girls, Celeste watched from the doorway. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that they were building something real, something lasting. But as she watched Marcus laugh with her daughters, a quiet fear crept in. She couldn't shake the feeling that this happiness was fragile, that it could be taken away in an instant. The weight of her past still loomed over her, a shadow she couldn't escape. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the penthouse, Celeste found herself sitting across from Marcus at the kitchen island. The twins were asleep, and the house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the city outside. Marcus sipped his coffee, his sharp gaze studying her. "You've been quiet today," he observed. "Something on your mind?" Celeste hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. She had been avoiding this conversation, but she knew she couldn't keep her past buried forever. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "about how I ended up like this." Marcus set his cup down, his expression softening. "You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready." She shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "No, I need to. You've done so much for us, and you deserve to know." Taking a deep breath, she began to recount her story. After high school, things had been good for a while. She got into college, studied communications, and dreamed of a career in public relations. Then she met Rick, charming, confident, and everything she thought she wanted at the time. "We started dating, and things moved too fast," she said, her voice trembling. "A few months later, I found out I was pregnant. I was terrified, but I thought Rick would stand by me. I told him, thinking we'd figure it out together." Her lips twitched into a bitter smile. "He didn't take it well. Said he wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility, that I was ruining both of our futures. A week later, he disappeared, changed his number, moved out of his apartment. I haven't seen him since." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, letting her continue. "I tried to manage on my own," she said, her voice breaking. "I worked 2 jobs while I was pregnant, barely scraping by. When the girls were born, I thought things would get easier, but it only got harder. Childcare was expensive, and no one wanted to hire a single mom who couldn't commit to long hours." Tears streamed down her face as she described the bills piling up, the missed rent payments, and the day her landlord told her she had to leave. "I had nowhere to go," she whispered. "We've been living in shelters when we can get a spot, or sleeping wherever we can find a little safety. I've done everything I can to protect my girls, but..." Her voice broke, and she covered her mouth with her hand, trying to hold back the sobs. Marcus reached across the table, placing a hand over hers. "You did the best you could," he said gently. "No one could have expected more." She looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed but defiant. It wasn't enough. They deserved better than this. Marcus's gaze flicked toward the living room, where Lila and Nia's toys were scattered across the floor. "They're resilient," he said, "and they're lucky to have you." Celeste shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't know how to fix this, Marcus. I don't know how to give them the life they deserve." "You don't have to do it alone," he said firmly. "We'll fix this together." For the first time since arriving at the penthouse, Celeste allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could start over. Months passed, and Celeste's life began to transform. She completed her professional development course, her confidence growing with each assignment. Marcus, true to his word, offered her a role at his company. She started as a project assistant, her determination shining through as she tackled each task with precision and care. The twins, Lila and Nia, flourished in their new environment. Their laughter filled the penthouse, and their bond with Marcus deepened. He became more than just a benefactor. He was a father figure, a constant presence in their lives. One evening, as the city lights sparkled against the night sky, Marcus led Celeste to the penthouse terrace. The air was crisp, the silence between them charged with unspoken emotions. "Celeste," he began, his voice steady but soft, "you show me what it means to care about something bigger than myself. You and the girls have become my family." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Inside was a delicate ring, its simplicity reflecting the sincerity of his words. "Will you marry me?" Celeste's breath hitched, tears welling in her eyes. For a moment, she was speechless. Then, with a trembling smile, she whispered, "Yes." Their wedding was simple yet heartfelt, held on the rooftop terrace. Lila and Nia, dressed in matching pale pink dresses, scattered petals along the aisle, their giggles filling the air. As Marcus and Celeste exchanged vows, the twins stood close, their small hands clutching their mother's dress. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Marcus leaned in, his kiss tender but full of promise. The small gathering erupted into applause, and Lila and Nia cheered, running to hug their mother and new father. The family moved into a spacious new home, where Lila and Nia had room to play and grow. Months later, Celeste gave birth to their son, completing their family. The video ended with a heartwarming scene of Marcus playing with the kids in the yard, their laughter echoing under the golden sunlight. From the streets to a loving home, their journey was a testament to love, resilience, and second chances.